Hello and welcome. My name is Debra Parr and I am faculty in the Art and Design Department here at Columbia College Chicago. I want to extend a special welcome to all families and friends who have joined us for this year's Art History Symposium, When Words Meet Images. 7 students will each present a 15-minute summary of their research that they've been working on all semester. Trying to capture the energy, dedication, the commitments, and complaints of these scholars has kept me up late the past few nights. I'm feeling a bit emotional. The research projects that they are about to share with you took shape over many months of writing and rewriting, sometimes 4 full drafts in all. These scholars, I can attest, take work and artwork seriously, demanding it to be something, if not something with an aura or ritual value, something that will make a difference, make a different world. Their fierce look at art and art institutions bodes well for the future of the field. There is much at stake for them and all of us in this work. Art as a category is not static. It may at times insist on its difference from adjacent fields such as illustration. More about that later. But it remains nonetheless ever responsive to politics, economics, issues of gender and race, and other social forces. The work of art history, therefore, is critical and contextual always. This criticality will be very evident in the research of the scholars presenting their work here this afternoon. The faculty of Columbia College Chicago, and in particular the art history faculty, deserve recognition for their work with these students, Doctors Amy Mooney and Oner Ozturk especially. I want to thank Duncan McKenzie, the chair of Art and Design, for his steadfast support always, along with the support of Dean Rosita Sands. I'd like to thank Joan Giroux, fabulous colleague, and Guy Villa, who helped make the art history catalog a reality. And please take one there on the table at the front.
The Holocaust was a mass cultural disabling event. Theorists such as Theodore Adorno, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Jean-Francois Lyotard questioned the ethics of pursuing artistic endeavors after the Holocaust. They claimed that there are hard limits to the representations of such trauma. They questioned whether anyone could have the ability to make art or write poetry in the face of an abyss now left in the place of such aesthetic activity. At the same time, many artists found art to be the only means to respond to such overwhelming trauma. After liberation in 1945, art appeared to shift stylistically and figuratively as it tried to represent the genocide of millions. In this presentation, I examine how artists responding to the trauma of the Holocaust historically turned first towards figuration and later to abstraction. This thesis is part of a larger project in which I analyze the binary opposition of realism and abstraction, and use Robert Morris's Untitled 1987 and Zoran Music's We Are Not the Last as case studies that exist at the collapse of realism and abstraction. Due to time constraints, I will only use Music's We Are Not the Last as an example of a third way to create art that commits to representing the Holocaust that is neither completely realistic nor abstract, while also testing the limits of representation. Before examining how life continued post-liberation, first there is a need to look into the art-making practices of those inside the concentration camps. Monica Baum-Dukin and Ziva Amishai-Maisel's essay, The Complexities of Witnessing, categorizes the different ways and motivations art was made inside of the prison camps. They classified them as, quote, official art, spiritual resistance through the assertion of individuality, the affirmation and confirmation of life, catharsis, and witnessing, end quote. The authors focus on witnessing in cases such as Maurice Bromberg, Auguste Favier, and Henri Pieix. Before being able to confront the traumatic abyss of the Holocaust, artists first depicted their experiences in realistic and figurative art. Realism contemporarily can be described as referring to art that represents subjects as they are. In relation to the representation of the Holocaust, for artists who are witnesses to the horror of the concentration camps, realism affords their depictions to become documents. While imprisoned, those who could make art tended to depict the labor demanded of them and the living conditions in their barracks. Imprisoned artists documenting their experiences produced many images depicting starving prisoners hunched over, pulling large rollers and wagons chained together like animals. Maurice Bromberg's 5 Jews and 1 Yoke Undated, for example, shows 5 men wearing striped uniforms. Their shaven heads face the viewers more so than their gaunt and darkened faces do. The darkness that consumes much of the image opens up space for abstraction, particularly the vague shapes eluded by their bodies contorting and meshing into one as they are forcibly engaged in arduous labor. Baumduken and Amichai Maisels describe the purpose of this imagery, explaining that it is not to portray resistance, but an endless and hopeless slavery. In drawings concerning living conditions in the camps, artists portray a sense of claustrophobia and uncertainty between the living and the dead. Similarly to their depictions of labor, these drawings document what is happening, but also aim to garner sympathy from the viewer. This desire can be seen in Block in the Little Camp, 1943, by Auguste Favier. Favier has drawn the deadly living conditions of his barracks. He depicts rows of narrow bunks with bald skeletal heads or feet protruding from them. 2 naked, carcass-like bodies are being assisted out of their sardined position by their bunkmates. Baumduken and Amichai Maisels describe this illustration as being more effective, perhaps by exaggerating physical form or by offering a first-hand look into the horrors that went unseen in photography and later hyper-realistic depictions of the living conditions faced in the camps post-liberation. It is in this artistic form, a documentary realism paired with an intense emotional vulnerability, that the case can be made for realism as being up to the challenge of depicting scenes that many find beyond representation. At the liberation of Buchenwald, Margaret Bork White photographed a wide image of men in striped uniforms behind a barbed wire fence. Titled Buchenwald, 1945, this image resembles a similar depiction drawn by Henri Piech behind the barbed wire circa 1945. Piech was imprisoned at the same camp in this photograph. Despite Bork White's image having a photographically accurate depiction of what was happening, Piech was able to depict the powerful emotions of his fellow inmates, whereas the camera can only capture the hardened faces they had to show in order to withstand their trauma. The problem that faced Piech and other prisoner artists was how to reveal emotions alongside facts so the viewers could grasp the truth and hold sympathy for those in the camps. As realism seems unable to represent the complexities of the horrors of the abyss, for some artists wrestling with the aftermath of the Holocaust, abstraction promises another tactic. Historian Mark Godfrey examines the turn artists make towards abstraction and their representations of the Holocaust. Godfrey was in Kassel for the art exhibition Documenta and found himself looking at the construction of Peter Eisenman's Holocaust Memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. For Godfrey, this monument embodies one of the first instances where an artist brings abstraction to a powerful and poignant representation of the horrors of the Holocaust. Godfrey describes abstraction as refraining from depiction, figuration, and sometimes overt symbolism to subvert a forced treatment of homogeneity in the field. Eisenman's monument sits on a 200,000 square foot site and is built of 2,711 concrete slabs. Godfrey finds this monument to be so significant, not because of the appearance of the slabs engaging the viewer, but the engagement with the space that was more compelling and symbolic. It must be noted that the Eisenman group found abstraction to be so necessary for a Holocaust monument because they believed that the experience would purposefully inhibit understanding, thus matching a belief that understanding the Holocaust is impossible. Many artists and theorists argue that abstraction is the only means of representation because of the genocide's incommensurability. Historian Michael Bernard Donals evokes Immanuel Kant in his essay, Between Sublimity and Redemption, toward a theory of Holocaust representation, writing, quote, "Perhaps the most sublime passage in the Jewish law is the commandment, 'Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image,'" end quote. Mark Godfrey and historian Janet Wolfe denounce this perspective, urging that it is of the utmost responsibility to understand the Holocaust and that it cannot be shirked on the belief that it is beyond comprehension. It becomes a matter of what form of representation is appropriate. To understand why someone might find abstraction to be the most effective means of memorializing the Holocaust, it is important to place it in a dialectical conversation with the monument that utilizes realism, the sculpture of Love and Anguish by Kenneth Triester. This sculpture is erected at the Holocaust Memorial of Miami Beach. The memorial space includes a bronze sculpture of an outstretched hand that measures over 4 stories high, with 130 bronze figures reaching out of the arm or surrounding it. The bodies are naked and emaciated, depicting vignettes of horror and despair. On the ground lies a woman, presumably dead. A baby is left abandoned, hidden under a coat, pleading and sobbing. Suffering is tangible and overwhelming in this monument. Whereas Triester's monument is direct, many could find its emotional intensity overwhelming to a point of no return. The appeal to abstraction in such a case is in what Godfrey describes as, quote, "an artwork's materiality, its situation, the process of its making, its composition, its title, its symbolic suggestions and counter-suggestions," end quote, rather than its representational specificity. However, an issue withstands that despite these formal tools, they are not foolproof in conveying any discernible meaning. If the title of an abstract work or its accompanying text does not suggest a clear reference to the Holocaust, does it no longer represent the Holocaust? In an effort to resolve the binary representational approaches of realism and abstraction, art historian Janet Wolfe asserts that art about the Holocaust that tends to steer clear of overt depictions of violence alongside distinct iconography, such as barbed wire, striped uniforms, yellow stars, and undecipherable abstraction, falls into a third category, which she refers to as elusive realism. Wolfe defines this as, quote, "the idea of a non-mimetic, non-abstract form of representation is based on a resistance to a too facile account with claims to both coherence and closure," end quote. Elusive realism allows the viewer to confront a subject without being led to a false sense of a conclusive narrative, and it also has the ability to avoid the vast and unclear openness of abstraction. Zoran Muzic's work collapses the realism-abstraction binary in the way he represents the Holocaust. His art practice can be distinguished and separated into 2 representative categories, one with landscapes and portraits of his wife, whereas the other stands as a traumatic reminder of his time in the Dachau concentration camp. Muzic's art clearly exemplifies the shift from realism, transitioning to abstraction, and in his We Are Not the Last series, falling into an emotionally vivid, elusive realism. In the 1950s and 60s, Muzic dedicated his practice to paintings of country and cityscapes, depicting the places he has moved to throughout his life. These paintings are simple, with bare bones of shapes, some distinctly more abstract than others. His early works start with bright, summery color palettes, and nearly a decade later, his paintings grow more somber, using grays and blacks in a Rorschach-ian manner, with approximations of skulls coming to the forefront. Another decade passed. Zoran Muzic makes the stark descent into We Are Not the Last. The We Are Not the Last paintings are inextricably tied first to his drawings in Dachau. Muzic was arrested in Venice in 1944 and transported to the Dachau concentration camp. During his year-long imprisonment, he managed to draw approximately 200 images documenting the treacherous conditions endured. Only 35 of these drawings survived after the war and stood as a referent for his later project. In these drawings, the consistent subject of a living corpse follows from one to the next. There is usually a group of 2 or 3 bodies laid next to each other. Usually one or all of them are in coffins. Although the coffin shapes are distinct, there is a sharp specificity that Muzic passes on in defining the bodies inside. A rib cage or sharp knee might be visible, but even in his realism, there is the beginnings of a collapse into abstraction. This visual theme is rife in a 1971 painting. 3 bodies are semi-distinct, but there is a suggestion they are just 3 that have breached the surface atop a pile of others. The only discernible limbs are a few arms, not each man showing their own. Their eyes and mouths are black holes, and rot emanates from both orifices. This death and doom is emphasized by Muzic's choices in color, with hues reminiscent of dried blood and decomposition, as well as the black in the background having a smoked out effect. Working in tandem with the formal qualities, Amichai Meisels describes Muzic's work as refusing the ahistoricization of the Holocaust, something that Wolff and Godfrey denounce in their argument for abstraction. With Muzic's motivation to prove that the Holocaust is not the last genocide, and therefore can and must be represented, he takes the motif of the corpse, quote, elevating them into symbols beyond the original event while still clearly evoking it. Elsewhere, the artist builds up masses of corpses, piled endlessly, one on the other, so that the ground seems literally covered with them. This endless sea of figures is no longer merely an image of the Holocaust, but of every man as victim, and of the future that awaits mankind if it does not mend its ways, end quote. Muzic used his own traumatic experiences to cast a spotlight on victims of genocides past and stoke the fire to advocate for potential victims in the future, exemplifying the power of elusive realism. To conclude, elusive realism is not just effective, but is growing to become a necessity in visual arts and media overall. The warnings from those who feared the impacts of realism echo here. With a constant barrage of violent imagery, of protests, war, and genocides akin to the Holocaust, many experience desensitization, a fetishization of violence, or they never return to the subject of suffering. Will artists today find themselves facing the same issues as artists in the 20th century? Questioning if it is all possible to make art after catastrophe, or facing the binary of realism and abstraction until it ultimately collapses into a third possibility for representation. Thank you.
In the 1960s and 70s, a term emerged seeking to categorize artwork that was inseparable, physically or ideologically, from its location. This term was site-specific. Since then, there has been significant growth in the role of site-specific work as a means of political resistance and institutional critique. While politically centered artists may struggle to retain the full purpose of their work in institutional environments due to the discrepancy between their values and the museum's problematic practices, site-specific works have uniquely resisted such occurrences through consideration of the historical, social, and political context behind a location. A large portion of scholarship on site specificity heavily favors 20th century case studies and often centers artists from the US and Europe. In this thesis, I identify 3 public site-specific works of the 21st century, specifically those working outside of the US and Europe and those concentrated in anti-colonial practices. While their 20th century predecessors like Daniel Buren and Hans Haacke participated in activism and institutional critique from inside the museum or gallery environment, several 21st century artists have created site-specific works, such as Doris Salcedo's Noviembre 6 y 7, Xochitl Rodriguez and Sandra Paula Lopez Ramirez's Trenzando Fronteras, or Braiding Borders, and the student-led Letterer Park Placards project, whose rejection of all forms of artistic institutions plays a stronger and more effective role in both institutional critique and political activism. Site specificity is a term that encompasses several types of art, including installation, performance, sculptures, murals, and may also exist in other manifestations such as land art. Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty is an example of a site-specific earthwork that is best experienced in person and whose removal would also spell its destruction. This is precisely what sets site-specific works apart. Modernist paradigms of the earlier 20th century, including the notion that art should be self-referential and autonomous, were evolved by the rise of postmodernism and rejected by site-specific artists. As Richard Serra wrote in 1985, his large public installation piece Tilted Arc was, quote, a site-specific work and as such not to be relocated. To remove the work is to destroy the work, end quote. No longer were museums and galleries neutral environments. Instead, early site-specific artists such as Hans Haacke challenged traditional, palatable notions of presenting art institutionally. These artists utilized the museum as both a physical and contextual site. Haacke's MoMA poll, for example, invited audience participation while simultaneously criticizing the museum's funding sources. As such, it is the defined relationship that site-specific art has to its location, which indicates its potential as a site for activism. Significant theoretical framework regarding site specificity was presented in the 90s by scholars Mi-Wan Kwon and James Meyer. Their work helped contextualize the role of 20th century site-specific art in institutional critique. In her essay, One Place After Another, Notes on Site Specificity, and book, One Place After Another, Site-Specific Art and Locational Identity, Kwon distinguishes three archetypes of site-oriented work referred to as phenomenological, discursive, and social institutional. The phenomenological site considers the conceptual expansion of the institution as a site, and artists like Richard Serra embrace this concept in their work. Intersection 2, for example, draws attention to the physical characteristics of the work in relation to its site. As the practice of site specificity expanded outside of the museum gallery environment, the sites that Kwon coined as discursive gained relevance as artists aimed to address pressing social discourses that had begun to arise. Take Haacke's MoMA poll as an example once again, which draws on both institutional critique and a larger sphere of political issues. Furthermore, Kwon's concept of social institutional, site-specific art includes works that consider the social, historical, and political context of a site to challenge the idea of art as a passive object. Instead, social institutional art embraces its activist contributions, and as Kwon writes, quote, the possibility to conceive the site as something more than a place, as repressed ethnic history, a political cause, a disenfranchised social group, is a crucial conceptual leap in redefining the public role of art and artists, end quote. Similarly, framework provided by James Meyer in his 1995 essay, The Functional Site, identifies the literal site, which is simply the physical location itself, and the functional site, which is the broader meaning given to a location through conversation, context, information, and documentation. However, Kwon and Meyer's framework should not be evaluated on a linear timeline, but rather as concepts that coexist simultaneously and which place site specificity at a crux between institutional involvement and an expanded socio-politically centered function. Recognition of the problematic practices of museums provides significant insight into why site-specific works presented outside of institutions retain more credibility in their activism. Artists whose work is socio-politically centered cannot display their art in museums without jeopardizing the meaning to benefit the discriminatory canon of such institutions. But what compels artists to reject institutions in the first place? To preface, it is important to note that exclusionary institutional systems are not autonomous, but rather supported by correspondent practices, creating a foundation which encourages new modes of artistic application. In his book On the Museum's Ruins, art historian Douglas Crimp maintains that the practice of art history plays a significant role in limiting critical discourse on museums. Crimp criticizes his fellow theorists, questioning why many of them omit analyses on, quote, work by feminists and minorities, whose marginalization by art institutions became a significant point of departure for artistic practices, end quote. Crimp makes a good point. Museums have a long-standing history of exclusion that doesn't seem to be getting any better. According to historian Alice Wexler, there was a high representational discrepancy in the late 90s and early 2000s. At the Museum of Modern Art, between 2000 and 2004, white men accounted for 80% of solo exhibitions, followed by white women at 13%, women of color at 7%, and men of color at 0%. Statistics that remain consistent at comparable institutions. But this was 20 years ago. What about now? A 2019 survey of the online collections of 18 major US-based museums found the results to be nearly the same. In fact, the data finds that about 90% of the artists in the Art Institute of Chicago's collections are white. Data on LGBTQ+ artists is even harder to come by. This is the point of necessary departure for many artists who have no choice but to find alternative modes of exhibition, since many are prevented from being accepted institutionally to begin with. Although I expand upon this further in my research, I will continue my focus on the practices of the Art Institute of Chicago. The director of the Art Institute, James Rondeau, made nearly $1 million in the 2019 fiscal year. Meanwhile, the museum, which claims to value equity and inclusion, only pays its employees a base salary of $45,000 and has consistently failed to respect indigenous culture despite residing on Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi land. The Art Institute and the School of the Art Institute are also guilty of receiving millions of dollars in funding from the Crown family, major stakeholders in General Dynamics, the 5th largest weapons manufacturer in the United States. When the Crown family profits from US imperialism, so does the Art Institute. As the organization Behind Enemy Lines puts it, quote, "In their own words, AIC states that a museum reflects and deepens our collective humanity. The arts are integral to an inspired and just society. Shouldn't an institution, with the reach and power that AIC has, uphold the values that it claims to represent?" End quote. With this in mind, we begin to piece together why site-specific works that reject artistic institutions are more effective in critique and activism. Those site-oriented works presented within museums are still valuable in their criticism. A growth in scholarship and recognition of site specificity has placed heightened gravity on the site itself. Even autonomous works can no longer expect to be removed from the context of the space in which they are presented. Now, there remains a lack of recognition of site-specific works in the 21st century deliberately contextualized through 20th century framework of site specificity. The first 21st century work that I highlight in my research is Doris Salcedo's Noviembre 6 y 7. This monumental installation references the highly contested history of the 1985 siege of the Palace of Justice in Bogotá, Colombia, by guerrilla fighters aiming to make the president stand trial. It was a tragic event in which the military's response left hundreds dead and the original building mostly destroyed. Nearly 20 years after the siege, the military's narrative had begun to unravel, and the families of the victims still sought answers. The installation features 280 wooden chairs lowered onto the newly built Palace of Justice over the course of 53 hours, representing the number of victims and the length of the event. It was a temporary public memorial whose site specificity allowed it to effectively confront pressing social issues and reshape painful historical narratives. This social institutional piece relies completely on the political and emotional history of the site itself and was intended to reach a specific audience, particularly families affected by the tragedy. Thus, it could not be recreated or re-experienced in the same way institutionally. And though images of the installation can be seen in exhibits, the work itself was originally created for deliberate public spectatorship. While Salcedo's work draws on installation as a commonly identified medium in site specificity, the fleeting nature of performance art marks it as another important iteration of the genre that uniquely participates in institutional critique through its intrinsic resistance of commodification. Trenzando Fronteras, or Braiding Borders, is a 2017 performance piece organized by Xochitl Rodriguez and Sandra Paula Lopez Ramirez in collaboration with the coalition Boundless Across Borders. 52 women from El Paso and Ciudad Juarez stood in a line on the Paso del Norte International Bridge that connects the two cities as they had their hair braided together, effectively forming a human chain. The moving performance, which draws on indigenous symbolism, took place during the inauguration of Donald Trump in a response to the dehumanizing rhetoric of him and his supporters. In a short film recounting the event, participants can be seen crying, smiling, singing, and embracing one another, a glimpse into the uniquely personal and emotional nature of Trenzando Fronteras. This performance is a sincere example of the convergence between Meyer's concept of the functional site and Kwan's concept of social institutional art. Compellingly, it draws a large location, the entire US-Mexico border, away from its existence as a literal site and into functionality through activism. It relies on the historical and social context surrounding the border, directly acknowledging a painful history rooted in colonialism. Recalling evidence of institutional exclusion and censorship, site-specific public performances such as this exist as inclusive spaces that reject the problematic canon of museums. Trenzando Fronteras exemplifies the necessary alternative practices that artists historically excluded by institutions have moved towards. Alongside the largely uncommodifiable nature of public performances, whose ephemerality refuses marketability, it is for these reasons that Trenzando Fronteras' rejection of the museum gallery environment allows for a more purposeful form of activism. Although the previously analyzed public works of the 21st century were quite visible and well documented, small-scale land-based art must also be recognized as valuable contributors to the genre of site specificity. The Lederer Park Placards Project is an interventionist piece created by Luke Meakin, Song-Ryung Liu, and Chelsea Borkman, students at Pennsylvania State University. The project took place in State College, Pennsylvania, and consisted of several engraved wooden placards that featured anecdotal prompts for visitors. The students intended to combat the settler colonial narratives upheld by the existence and design of public parks. In this case, they chose Lederer Park. According to Michelle S. Bay-Demetriadis and Luke Meakin in Land-Based Art Intervention, Disrupting Settler Colonial Curriculum of Public Parks, the namesake of the park was a family of real estate developers whose role in the expansion of State College through the sale and purchase of land as property upheld a deeply rooted settler culture. Originally, 22 bronze placards in the park dedicated trees to residents of the town. None mention the Susquehannock land on which the park resides, or the history of the Susquehannock people. As such, Meakin, Liu, and Borgman covered the bronze placards with wooden ones on which disruptive prompts were engraved to encourage visitors to participate and ponder. One prompt reads, "Pick a direction. Keep walking in that direction until you are no longer on stolen land. How far did you have to walk? Tip, consider packing swimwear and sturdy hiking boots." While another reads, "Settler-descended visitors to this park often feel entitled to let their dogs run unleashed here. Disrupt the calm acquiescence of this place which reinforces their entitlement. Bark at a dog." The site-specific nature of the Lederer Park Placards Project is the reason that it is effective in its anti-colonial intervention. Once again, we see Lederer Park raised from its mundane capacity as a literal site and into functionality. As a result, the students were able to encourage anti-colonial discourse with a specific audience, in this case, the nearly 90% of State College residents who are white, in a space that is perhaps unexpected. What may also be unexpected is the relationship the project has to institutional critique. By nature, anti-colonial, non-institutional works confront the colonialism upheld by museums. As I argue in my larger body of research, the museum, which still attempts to see itself as a neutral space, will rarely or never let itself be the site of true resistance. The narrative must be dismantled from the outside. As a public work, the Lederer Park Placards Project utilizes site specificity to simultaneously participate in settler colonial critique and in turn reject the concept of institutional neutrality. If a seemingly innocent public park is not immune to interventionist tactics that encourage a confrontational discussion, then a precedent is set that seeks to condemn institutions on a larger scale. Site specificity, in every form, articulates autonomous locations as mediums themselves. The site is promoted as something more than architectural, but instead a convergence of social contexts, politics, emotions, histories, and discourses. Noviembre 6 y 7, Trenzando Fronteras, and the Lederer Park Placards Project are three 21st century works that have been overlooked in the context of site-specific theory in comparison to their 20th century counterparts, but which resist institutionalization by nature. Perhaps these often innovative and sometimes provocative ways of exhibiting art will lead us down a path towards a more inclusive art world, or simply a more inclusive world. Thank you.
In examining art throughout history, the role that emerges is to document and react, as the perception of historical artwork is warped by the context of the time it was created. For instance, times of war, revolution, or religious revival. Contemporary artworks, however, are not warped through the lens of any one crisis, but instead an amalgamation of crises that are interconnected and create an altogether larger issue. The cyclical nature and compounding effect of crises in the 21st century create a polycrisis, in which all problems plaguing society are inextricably tangled. In the polycrisis, the role of art is to function as social commentary, despite its marketability and existence as a consumer good. The 2019 Venice Biennale, titled May You Live in Interesting Times, begins to address this role, but even if the Biennale does not function as an art fair, it still showcases the art world's clumsy attempts to dual-wield luxury consumerism and necessary resistance. As the doomsday clock counts down, the desire for art has shifted from beautifying and documenting society to influeyuencing radical change as a more active participant. Some artworks from the 2019 Venice Biennale, like Can't Help Myself by Sun Yuan and Peng Yu, fulfill the desire for social critique by showcasing flawed and failing systems. Other works, like Biologizing the Machine, Tentacular Trouble by Annika Yi, suggest a light at the end of the tunnel by offering a vision of the world post-crisis. The generally accepted definition of the word polycrisis is the simultaneous occurrence of several catastrophic events. The word originates from a 1999 book by Edgar Morin and Anne Bridget Kern called Homeland Earth, a manifesto for the new millennium, which discusses Earth as a complex system riddled with past, present, and future societal and environmental issues, rather than a fixed object on which humans live. Polycrisis was then used liberally in speeches by politicians and environmental activists alike in 2016 and 2018, then exploded into public awareness in 2022, amidst the pandemic, manufacturing shortages, widespread civil rights protests, and political unrest. Violade is a researcher and science journalist who makes a case for two distinct definitions of polycrisis, one for a polycrisis and one for the polycrisis. A polycrisis is then any instance where an interconnected group of crises compound to create a larger and more complex crisis, and the polycrisis is the referential, ongoing global crisis of the 21st century. In such times, where crises like global warming fundamentally warp day-to-day actions and recontextualize the most mundane statements, contemporary art cannot exist separately from contemporary problems. Ralph Rugoff understood the necessity for art to respond to mounting unrest while curating the 2019 Venice Biennale, May You Live in Interesting Times. The title of the show comes from a fictitious Chinese curse that has been widely circulated in the West post-World War II, despite having no origin as an actual curse, Chinese or otherwise. The phrase was quoted in earnest by Sir Austen Chamberlain and Robert F. Kennedy most notably. The repurposing of the fake curse as a title alluded to misinformation and fake news, which were hot topics in 2019 amidst the Trump presidency and Brexit negotiations. Of the title, Rugoff said, quote, "I wanted to find a way to address this precarious moment without being pessimistic, hence the neutrality of the title. Is it a curse to live in interesting times, or is it a blessing?" Unquote. This aspiration to be topical in theme, but non-committal in tone, fell short of the expectations of many critics whose attention had been piqued by the show's title. The phrase, "May you live in interesting times," removed from the context of its fake origin, still carries an ominous tone. Critics and viewers alike were eager for Rugoff's Biennale to fully embrace its institutional power as a site for reckoning with an increasingly difficult climate. The dilemma of the Venice Biennale acting to highlight art's relationship to resistance, as well as art's relationship to power structures, is as Border Crossings writer Gregory Burke describes, quote, "It is an event that can't help but showcase art's relation to power, and yet the Biennale has been, at least since 1993, when Hans Haacke smashed the marble floor of the Nazi-era German pavilion, frequently activated by artists as a platform to resist the politics that engendered the interesting times Rugoff denotes. Herein lies a conundrum, given he so clearly suggests a political turn, yet states empathetically that art does not exercise its forces in the domain of politics. If there is a dissonance in his organizing principles, they also beg the question as to whether art can non-politically temper malignant ideologies." End quote. To instantly disagree with Rugoff, art does exercise its forces in the domain of politics, often, and with results. The contradiction of engaging with a world enduring catastrophic events while having apolitical aspirations is disappointingly corporate. At the Venice Biennale specifically, where the effects of global warming are impossible to ignore, there is the opportunity for art to be extremely direct and meet the sense of urgency built into the site. Ben Davis, who writes on art's acknowledgement of planetary doom, offers a scathing review. Quote, Rugoff's lack of thematic framework seemed like a weary shrug in the decaying city of Venice, itself a prolonged symbol of entropy. A judgment underlined by the vagueness of the title he chose, as if the substance of meaning itself were crumbling into the Grand Canal. May you live in interesting times. Title and tonal intent aside, the structure of the Biennale itself was also widely critiqued. Rugoff organized May You Live in Interesting Times in two exhibitions, Proposition A and Proposition B, with the first being shown in the Arsenale and the latter in the Central Pavilion, or Giardini. The physical double presence in two distinct exhibitions was meant to comment on the viewer's presence in a, quote, polarized world where people inhabit separate information landscapes, unquote. In actuality, this division led people to question if Proposition A was the main event, with Proposition B acting as a sideshow or B-side. The literal disruption of the Biennale's unity also left viewers unsure of the significance of the two exhibitions regarding the overall theme. Considering a proposition is a suggested plan of action, the titles left viewers seeking some hidden meaning and a difference between A and B. Rugoff was clearly intentional in his choice to include only 79 contemporary artists working in a broad range of media, who each had one piece shown in the Arsenale and another in the Central Pavilion. Individually, these artists were grappling with and responding to dire subject matter, but in putting these works in conversation, the Biennale made no clear statement regarding our interesting times. Rugoff has stated that his interpretation of the social function of art is its ability to provide entertainment and pleasure, as well as social critique. But in May You Live in Interesting Times, the emphasis on duality came across as indecisive rather than profound. In almost perfect opposition, Sun Yuan and Peng Yu's collaborative practice does not shy away from confrontation and instead leans into the inevitable warping of meaning through site and circumstance. Yuan and Yu both attended the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing for oil painting, and since beginning their partnership 24 years ago, have risen to fame for their use of dark humor, human remains, and live animals in conceptual art. One of their most challenging pieces, Dogs That Cannot Touch Each Other, was originally shown and filmed in 2003. A video of the piece was infamously one of 3 withdrawn from a show in the Guggenheim in 2017, among accusations of animal cruelty. The materials aren't always so controversial. For instance, the 2 pieces shown in the 2019 Venice Biennale. Deer, first shown in 2015, was in Proposition A of the Biennale in the Arsenale, and consisted of a large chair, like those seen in monuments, with a hose protruding from the seat that intermittently whips around when pressurized water is run through it. Can't Help Myself, from 2016, was shown in Proposition B in the Central Pavilion. Both works shown in the 2019 Venice Biennale are mainly made up of technologic components, performing computerized actions that suggest physical or mental pain and evoke empathy. In this way, they bring humanity and ethics into question by positioning machines as having the capacity to suffer. Yuan and Yun's large-scale installations often ask something of the viewer: to traverse a space, to peek into a peephole, to stand at a window. In engaging with the often provocative work, viewers become either complicit participants or a witness, only for the artist to turn around and ask if there's really any difference. This lack of ability to remain an innocent bystander is ingrained in their work and reflects the society that the artists work within. By simply living in a polycrisis, one becomes complicit in any number of self-defeating systems and acts as a witness to everyday violence and injustice. Yuan and Yu's inclusion of offensive materials in manufactured tragic scenarios are widely considered to be cruel. This is visible throughout their practice, but most obvious in pieces like Dogs That Cannot Touch Each Other. It could be argued that these cruelties are pre-existing, and that the upset lies in inserting those narratives into sanitized, high-visibility arenas, like a museum or biennale. In all fairness, it is easier to remove an artwork from a museum than it is to dismantle the structures that the artwork critiques. Can't Help Myself was originally commissioned by the Guggenheim Museum in 2016 for the Tales of Our Time exhibition. Rugoff invited the artists to show it again in 2019 for May You Live in Interesting Times. In Can't Help Myself, an industrial robot leaking red, blood-like fluid relies on a Cognex visual recognition sensor to contain the fluid within a certain zone. The robot itself consists of one big mechanical arm with a squeegee shovel attachment and is programmed to execute 32 distinct movements, ranging from scratch and itch to ass shake. The robot's futile efforts to contain the red liquid leave smears on the floor and splatters on the polycarbonate walls of its enclosure. From outside these blood-splattered walls, the robot looks and behaves like a caged animal, forced to perform endlessly for viewers. The Sisyphean task of the Can't Help Myself robot came to an end in 2019, when it slowed, stilled, and never moved again. A popular misconception that aids in empathetically animating the work is that the liquid leaking from the robot is its own hydraulic fluid that it desperately shovels back into itself in order to continue to operate. In reality, the piece is electric, and in late 2019, near the end of its time on view, it was simply turned off. After watching the robot perform countless bow and shake movements, the eerie footage of the robot completely motionless in its fake blood-splattered enclosure does give the impression that the robot's dead body is on display. In November of 2021, a video of the piece from the Biennale went viral on TikTok and quickly became a cross-platform sensation. TikTok users set videos of the robot to songs like popular melancholy French instrumental Je te le saurai by Patrick Watson, Lana Del Rey's Dealer, or Radiohead's depression anthem Exit Music for a Film, with the most popular caption being, "It looks so tired." Connections to the piece were also formed in its absence, with "It looks so tired" attributed to any video of someone doing a repetitive, meaningless task, or any machine with an automated action that can never truly be fulfilled. For instance, the robot at IKEA that endlessly tests the durability of a chair. These TikToks were often set to the same sad songs as the original viral video of the robot. Tumblr contributed posts like a glitter edit GIFs of the robot where the red liquid sparkles in a fashion reminiscent of a bygone blingy era. Responses to these posts were usually some form of yassified, mood, I've been through more than her, and this is what working in retail over Christmas feels like. On TikTok, Tumblr, and beyond, memes of Can't Help Myself linger even now, over 2 years later. The ability of this work to hold the public's attention for so long is no small feat on hyper-saturated social media in the face of a fast-evolving, highly publicized polycrisis. Can't Help Myself's continued relevance and afterlife on the internet speaks to its desirability. When so many present-day crises involve a fight for control that devolves into an antagonistic back and forth, it is easy to see how Can't Help Myself reflects a power imbalance that viewers find familiar. The struggle of the everyday person fighting the good fight can feel minuscule under the shadow of something like rampant pollution by a megacorporation. The work is constantly undone. The liquid is shoveled back just to leak out again. In witnessing, reacting to, and living within the polycrisis, it would be easy to give in to despair. Art may not fix the world, but having drawn attention to the areas that require action, art can do more than declare moral bankruptcy. Annika Yee's piece from Proposition B of the 2019 Venice Biennale allowed viewers a glimpse of an imagined future in which progress has not come at the cost of environmental collapse. In Yee's installation of Biologizing the Machine, Tentacular Trouble, cocoon-like sculptures made of semi-transparent, kelp-based material were lit from within and suspended above craters and puddles of water in the concrete floor. These forms were intentionally reminiscent of embryos, connecting the idea of the machine to that of human origin, hence the title, Biologizing the Machine. In material as well as concept, Yee's work exists at the intersection of biomatter and technological advance, which presents an unlikely but hopeful co-adaptation. This stance reminds us that crisis is not a foreclosure. We are not doomed. Times of crisis are turbulent, which makes it a possible point of change and action. In the polycrisis, art has a responsibility to be critical, self-critical even, but this does not have to come at the cost of positivity. Art in emergencies can be more than a, quote, weary shrug in the decaying city of Venice, unquote. It is important to remember that social commentary is not pointing and complaining. It is critique in order to promote change. Thank you.
Since the daguerreotype was unveiled to the world in 1839, photography's documentary realism has been under constant attack. And while many of these critiques are warranted, the camera's unique position as a truly democratized tool positions the photograph as a site of revolt. In an era where the working people of the world are besieged by bourgeois interest and a hyper-commodified mass culture, documentary photography offers laborers the opportunity to wade through the social residue of neoliberal ideology, which has scattered their labor power and plagued them with a diluted citizenship. It is no secret that documentary photography alone cannot overthrow this socioeconomic behemoth, but it is entirely capable of combating the neoliberal aversion to class visibility and inclusive citizenship within visual cultures, two factors informing the dominant ideology throughout the global north. I will only have time to discuss how documentary photography can affect class visibility and consciousness within the dominant ideology, but I extend this argument to citizenship in a much longer paper. Neoliberalism is often associated with the privatization of state-owned industries and the rise of global commerce, but is much larger in scope, with talons ensnaring society at nearly every level. In Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism's Stealth Revolution, political theorist Wendy Brown succinctly describes neoliberalism as a, quote, rationality that disseminates the model of the market to all domains and activities, even where money is not an issue, and configures human beings exhaustively as market actors, always, only, and everywhere a homo economicus. By interpolating individuals into subjects with production as their primary function, laborers are whittled down to little more than human capital. Those who submit to this formation by, quote, self-investing in ways that enhance their value or attract investors through constant attention to actual or figurative credit rating, and do this across every sphere of existence, unquote, simultaneously reproduce neoliberal relations of production, contribute to production, and reinforce the construction of subjects as competitors. Although whether this translates into material wealth for the individual is doubtful. Neoliberalism is largely a game of smoke and mirrors, dividing laborers under the auspices of greater individual freedom in order to benefit the upper class. Art is one of many channels that can help working people peer through this mist by transmitting messages that conflict with neoliberal ideology. In Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, Notes Towards an Investigation, philosopher Louis Althusser defines ideology as, quote, the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence, unquote. While situating state apparatuses as a force eclipsing repressive state apparatuses, which secure the power of capital owners through the threat and execution of violence. With the primary function of reproducing class relations, ideological state apparatuses are an indispensable asset to the economic elite. But fortunately for working people everywhere, the ruling class cannot assert their dominion over ISAs as thoroughly as they can RSAs. Althusser suggests as much when he writes, quote, the ideological state apparatus may be not only the stake, but also the site of class struggle, and often of bitter forms of class struggle. The class or class alliance in power cannot lay down the law in the ISAs as easily as it can in the repressive state apparatus, not only because the former ruling class are able to retain strong positions there for a long time, but also because the resistance of the exploited classes is able to find means and occasions to express itself there, either by the utilization of their contradictions or by conquering combat positions in them in struggle, unquote. With ideology sitting somewhere along the front lines of contemporary class struggle, the dissemination of subversive material through what Althusser calls the cultural ISA, which explicitly includes the arts, has the potential to disrupt the neoliberal order. Of all the fields within visual cultures, documentary photography is particularly well positioned to harness the cultural ISA and affect the dominant ideology in ways that would maintain the idea of class and even build bridges between laborers. At the heart of the documentary tradition are subjects who primarily occupy an environment outside of the photographer's control. Early in the second chapter of The Civil Contract of Photography, photography theorist Ariella Ozole defines the medium as, quote, an apparatus of power that cannot be reduced to any of its components, a camera, a photographer, a photographed environment, object, person, or spectator. Photography is a term that designates an ensemble of diverse actions that contain production, distribution, exchange, and consumption of the photographic image, unquote. Applying this framework to documentary photography turns the tradition into an apparatus encompassing the subject and their material conditions at the time of production, regardless of the photographer's potential to exploit or misrepresent them. When laborers are positioned as the subject of a documentary project, their pre-existing exploitation is embedded within the image, although not as a formal element. Osley approaches this conundrum later when she writes, quote, "A photograph does in fact attest to what was there, although its evidence is partial, and only in this sense is it false," unquote. The photographer's ability to clearly communicate what was there does not just depend on how familiar they are with the camera, but also how well they use the tools available to them in the distribution process. Many photographers have been able to wrap their heads around the former, but few have successfully harnessed the latter, which is the most practical way to affect the cultural ISA. One of the earliest documentarians to challenge neoliberalism through photography was Chris Killip. He created several bodies of work throughout the 1970s and 80s, exposing the material realities of working-class Britons in Northeast England, beginning with the energy crisis and concluding well into Margaret Thatcher's time as Prime Minister. Killip spent years immersing himself into these communities, creating gorgeous documentary images, differentiating himself from a photography world that had largely pivoted toward fine art photography in the early 1980s. In Chris Killip, the last photographer of the working class, art historian and theorist Clive Dilnot eschews this trend, suggesting it reveals, quote, "the severe limitations of exhibition value," unquote, with exhibition value referring to an art object's pleasurable aesthetic, which runs the risk of transmitting an understanding of the world ignorant of class and history. More so than most documentary photographers, Killip's images maintain the concept of class while also relaying how historical events impact laborers. Nowhere is this more apparent than Seacole Beach, Lynmouth, Northumbria, October 1983, a photograph from Killip's Seacole project. 3 young men shovel coal into 2 horse-drawn carriages along the beach. Thatcher has just won her second term as Prime Minister, and rising unemployment has caused the seaside community to survive off the proceeds they get from selling coal that is washed ashore. The shell of an automobile sits a few yards back, stripped of tires. It has been a decade since the oil crisis, but it could have been yesterday by the looks of things. A distant smokestack towers over an otherwise barren landscape, an artifact from a not-so-distant past brimming with well-paying factory jobs. Beyond revealing how deindustrialization and the Tories' abysmal policies impacted working Britons, Killip's projects also act as a bridge of connection, welcoming viewers to build solidarity with the photographed subject. However, this arrangement can only ever create a one-sided relationship between the subject and viewer, and perhaps more importantly, his maintenance of class visibility does little more than show an incomplete picture of what he found in Northeast England. LaToya Ruby Fraser, on the other hand, goes beyond Killip in her effort to disrupt neoliberal hegemon. In her most recent project, The Last Cruise from 2019, Fraser follows Local 1112 of the United Auto Workers Union and other employees at the Lordstown Assembly after General Motors announced it was discontinuing the Chevrolet Cruze, the only automobile produced in the factory. Beyond pushing class aesthetics to the limit, Fraser opts to capture portraits through long exposures, refusing to follow a history of predatory snapshots dotting the documentary tradition. As art critic Zach Hatfield writes in American Idol, Zach Hatfield on LaToya Ruby Fraser's The Last Cruise, 2019, quote, "Fraser's own deaccelerated exposures requires her subjects, already in stasis, to hold themselves for the camera, a stillness they can control. These are not candid snapshots, nor do they purport to be. They sound what is quite explicitly a dialogue between Fraser and her subjects, holding their poses. The sitters are working with the artist," unquote. By giving subjects some agency over their own image, The Last Cruise turns into a collaborative project. But this partnership isn't confined to production. Many of Fraser's portraits circulate alongside an oral history element, allowing subjects to speak directly to the viewer. In the supplement to one portrait, Sharia Duncan of the UAW Local 1112 and her family used their platform to praise trade unions and share some anecdotes about alienation and other trouble caused by their jobs. The image itself hints to each oral history element, but without the text exhibited beside the image, it'd be impossible for a viewer to fully understand the work. Duncan and her mother, Waldine Arrington, sit in the center of the frame, gazing directly into the camera, which is positioned opposite the family's kitchen table. A clear allusion to Fraser's mentor, Carrie Mae Weems, and her kitchen table series from 1990. But while Weems' project foregrounds androcentrism and unpaid reproductive labor, Fraser's portrait of the Duncans highlights the challenge of balancing reproductive and wage labor for working-class families. Both Duncan and her mother reflect on Duncan's early days at the factory in their oral history segments. Arrington was initially worried about her daughter, but felt more at ease knowing the union had their back because, quote, "we were united. And if something went wrong with somebody's kid, somebody would get the message to you. So I knew she was basically safe," unquote. Duncan remembers learning about how the reports would pass along to her mother just to make sure she was doing all right. Arrington sits to the left, wearing a UAW Local 1112 hoodie. Her daughter sits to the right with a shirt that reads "Overcoming Obstacles," cluing viewers into the union's current predicament. Besides Duncan sits her husband, Jason, another employee at the Lordstown Assembly. Despite the couple's proximity, there appears to be some distance between the two. Duncan explains how they hardly ever see each other because of their conflicting schedules. Jason glances across the table at their daughter, Olivia. He recounts a time when no one was able to take care of her after school, forcing him to bring her into work. Friends watched over Olivia in the team room throughout his shift, showering her in all sorts of snacks. With the plant shutting down, the family has little choice but to move. Jason's story, the last to supplement the portrait, ends with him longing for a community lost and lamenting the life he will have to rebuild elsewhere. Through these photographs and their oral history elements, Fraser's subjects contextualize themselves within the gallery, creating explanative guardrails in institutions that have long been plagued by individual interpretation. Fraser's skill at disseminating dissent through the cultural ISA largely comes from the structure she places within institutions to translate her intent to the viewer. In participating in the Neoliberal Art Museum, art educators Rena Kundu and Nadine M. Kalin discuss how museums have adopted to neoliberalism by offering participatory activities used to secure the primary funding mechanism of nonprofit institutions, visitors. The shallow engagement rarely translates to any form of, quote, resistance, agitation, or destabilization of the status quo, end quote. The oral history Fraser includes alongside her photographs guide viewers through the complexities of her subject matter rather than allowing them to construct meaning themselves. These guides are bolstered by visits from UAW Local 1112 members, economists, and politicians who chat with Fraser and the public, leveling long-held hierarchies surrounding whose voice deserves to be heard within the institution. To combat issues of accessibility, the Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago published the project's catalog, with each oral history situated beside its corresponding image and transcripts of the in-person conversations. This book comes with a number of new supplements, including an accessible explanation of employees and employers' rights in regards to union organizing, the benefits of forming a union, and the political function of unions outside the workplace. This can be seen as an attempt by Fraser to use the cultural ISA to reanimate the trade union ISA, which is the only ISA structured around class-conscious activity. Positioning this besides the content of The Last Cruise encourages viewers to tend to their immediate safety and material needs by unionizing, while simultaneously demonstrating the fragility of organized labor in neoliberal contexts, signaling the need for transformative action following the unionization process. Whether neoliberalism's successor manifests as a restoration of the social welfare state, a move toward radical democracy, or even a socialist revolution is impossible to predict. But what is certain is that the neoliberal hegemon, like capitalism more broadly, is a historically contingent formation destined to conclude somewhere down the line. What happens next is largely up to the working people of the world, but without coming together as a class, there is little reason for capital's domination over labor to change in any way whatsoever. Documentary photography is just one of many tools capable of affecting the dominant ideology. But without action, neoliberalism is here to stay. Thank you.
As you were researching, did you have a piece that you came across that was one of your favorites and really affected you. So do you have a favorite piece from your research?
In my research, a piece that really stood out to me was the last one that I presented on, which was the Letter Park Placards Project, because I thought it was interesting that something so small could have that much of an impact on institutional critique and in activism. And that was something that really opened my eyes when I was researching, because originally I started with the first piece that I talked about, the huge monumental installation. So to go from something so big to something so small was very interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, my favorite was also the last piece that I showed, the last cruise. I think it really gave me some hope in the institution. Yeah.
Thank you for your question. I think something that stood out to me most was actually the image that I did not include in my presentation. I think both of the images were placed in a conversation with each other, and to see how their motivations were brought about and using images from the war, and not just of victims in Europe, but of victims in Japan. I think just taking something that is so obscene and making sure that it's so impactful and relatable to what's going on, especially today, I think is really important. Thank you.
My favorite was definitely the Can't Help Myself robot. That one definitely shaped my whole thesis once I realized how viral it had gone years after being shown, which kind of brought mine into a more current, contemporary space. Thank you.
Thank you so much for excellent, well-researched work. Very impressive, to say the least. One of the themes I noticed between all of the papers was the viewer experience. You all kind of tried to address the impact. And I'm curious if you all could perhaps expand a little bit. Like, how do we know these works impacted the viewer? I think, Bai, in your piece, we have this evidence of social media, right? We have this other question of public response to monuments and the like. So it would be kind of interesting to see you guys expand upon how we know and kind of come to understand the impact of spectatorship.
Thank you for that question, Amy. I think for me, definitely, my research was hugely shaped by where people were saying what they didn't like and what wasn't working, and that let me know what they were wanting, because it was talking about where the work kind of like failed or where they were dissatisfied. Specifically in, I talk a lot about the Biennale, but the difference between the pieces that people kept returning to and keep making relevant versus the pieces and then the overall tone where there was like something to be desired there. Both of those together kind of shaped what I interpreted people wanted from art, which is a little bit more social commentary.
Yeah, thank you for that question. In the first piece that I talked about, the Doris Salcedo piece, the reason that she made it was really to connect with the families of the victims of the event that it was alluding to. And when she made it, she found that people were walking up on the street and crying, and they had a very emotional reaction to it because they felt that finally someone was seeing what had happened to their family members, or that someone was starting to talk about it at the very least. And so I think that was a very moving, it was very moving to learn that it did have an actual effect on the people that she intended to have an effect on. As for the other pieces, a similar thing happened with the Braiding Borders piece, in which all the women that were involved, it was a very emotional process for them. And I think in that piece, it was a bit different because the viewers were also aspects of the performance. And in the last piece, I think that was the one that had the least amount of information about whether or not people were actually impacted, but they did learn that it made people uncomfortable, visitors to the park. So yeah.
Thank you for your question. For the last cruise, from what I understand, while it was going through different spaces, being exhibited at different spaces, the conversations that they had were pretty continued, at least up until COVID. And from what I understand, they were also pretty well attended. I couldn't find anything on whether or not someone went off and made a union after reading the section of the book, but fingers crossed.
Thank you, Amy. The impact of viewership really played a part in my research because so many theorists from, the 1940s up until now talk about how impossible it is to look at the Holocaust and look at images of the Holocaust. And I was really interested to see how that was combated and because it is so necessary to look at what is going on in our world contemporarily and in the past. And so seeing how artists can engage the viewer to make it most effective, especially in looking at, again, how realism impacts viewership and in the news today. So yeah, looking at how art can move outside of the world of news, but still be so exacting and trying to figure out how to make it matter to people. Thank you.
I have a question. So actually for you, B, and then sort of another question for everybody. Had you looked at all in the course of your looking at work that was made in the concentration camps? Had you made any kind of look at both things like incarcerated prisoners' artwork, but then also the work of the Japanese Americans who were interned in the United States to make any kind of comparison to what was going on there, and also some of the work that's been done by Japanese Americans after that about the incarceration of U.S. citizens in the United States during World War II? Did that cross in your research at all?
Thank you for that question, Joan. That, not particularly. I think there is a lot of room in the research post-grad that I really want to do, looking at, again, contemporarily, how we look at art and relating to catastrophes. I think there is more than just worthwhile scholarship that I need to look at in the future. I also looked at, still in Europe, but I looked at music and theater and other forms of art making, because in some camps it was allowed to a certain degree, but I definitely want to look at how in the States, how that was.
Yeah, okay. And then just for everybody, kind of a broader question, which I think was very explicitly touched on in a couple of the papers, Julia, yours, and also I'm spacing out, Julia and B, both of yours, and then to another degree with Justin and Bai both. What is the art historian position regarding the moral responsibility of the artist to bear witness in the times of polycrisis? Because we certainly do find ourselves in many of those.
I think it's the responsibility of everyone to bear witness.
Thank you for your question. In my research, when I talked about the art historian Douglas Crimp, who discusses the role of art history and the sometimes problematic role that it can have, in my research, it was more about limiting critical perception of museums and artistic institutions. But I do think that art history plays a really big role in a lot of that stuff. People might not realize how influential it can be, but I think just that alone is proof enough that it has a lot of power in influencing how we see things or the action that we take. So in terms of our the necessity of bearing witness, I think art history is hugely influential, and that I agree with Justin in providing us the space to understand that we should all bear witness.
At the very beginning of forming my thesis, I was reading Funny Weather by Olivia Lang, and it hugely shaped everything I was thinking about. And kind of the second half of that book is about artists who make work about bearing witness and dealing with violence. And my thesis almost took a kind of different direction about how to navigate the world, you have to be somewhat desensitized, and art offers a space to be empathetic and to kind of flex that muscle in a safe space and to deal with things that you sometimes really cannot process and deal with in the moment in the world for safety or just in order to keep it pushing. I think dealing with crisis and catastrophe, that's a huge part of it. There's so much, the polycrisis, there's so much all the time. Even if we could respond to it in real time, we'd have to be responding to a million things at once, and art gives a kind of space and grace to deal with that, I think.
Thank you. A big part of my research was on bearing witness and how, again, on the conversation that the Holocaust is incommensurable, there was a lot of conversation and there is no translation of what happened to be able, for witnesses. There's no language, there's no images. And so I think that with that aside, we have to find the language. It's not an impossibility of language. It's finding how we can understand it, even if it is in kind of an immature language, or it's our responsibility, like Justin said so succinctly, to find ways to bear witness and to do it. I think art historians are at the crux of anthropology, culture, history, and we have to find the ways to make sure everyone sees.
When I started this thesis, I knew that I wanted to look into illustration history. When I did that, I noticed immediately that compared to the amount of text on graphic design or comics, there was very little research and writing on illustration. That is the argument driving my thesis, that illustration needs further research and understanding because it is a powerful force of change in our world. So what is illustration and why isn't it art or graphic design? The root of the word illustrate is the Latin word illustrare, meaning to make light or explain. In Middle English, the word illustrate means to make clear, explain, or give glory to something. The Oxford Dictionary definition is, quote, a drawing or picture in a book or magazine for decoration or to explain something, unquote. The common thread through all of these is that illustration explains and clarifies. Interestingly, however, the most recent definition in the Oxford Dictionary relegates illustration to images that accompany text and emphasizes its use for decoration above explanation. In his book, Illustration, A Theoretical and Contextual Perspective, illustration scholar Alan Mayle wrote that, quote, without a context, an image cannot be described as being an illustration, unquote. Illustrations are working images. They come from a need and they fulfill a contextual purpose related to explaining or clarifying, as opposed to art, which does not need a context to exist, and graphic design, which doesn't necessarily have to explain anything. Illustration also prioritizes clear communication over aesthetics. The purpose is communication, and the aesthetics or appeal of the image are tools an illustrator might use to achieve that primary purpose. In many of his books, Alan Mayle talks about his idea of the 5 contextual domains. I find these helpful to sorting the needs that illustration addresses in a society. The first is information, informative images that elucidate information, often seen in medical or historical textbooks, an image that has a purpose of explanation. Commentary. This used to be a much more prominent element of illustration's function in society, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. These are images that comment on or critique the society they were made in. Narrative fiction. These are images made for the purpose of setting a tone or telling a story. This includes graphic novels or long-form visual storytelling. However, it also includes single illustrations with narrative elements. Persuasion. In the contemporary illustration discipline, this contextual domain is linked closest to advertisement. However, any image that is created to influence opinion or action would fall in this domain. And finally, identity. These are images intended to create or strengthen community ties or give imagery for groups to rally around. This is a 19th century medical illustration, an example of an image within the information domain. One of the things illustration can do that photography cannot is convey the texture of a topic. This is a function of illustration that is still crucial for many industries, notably medical or historical education. This is an image by Rodolphe Töpfer, who is thought to be the father of comics. And this is from an essay he did on the pseudoscience of physiognomy, which assumed that a person's character or intellect could be read in their facial features, clearly a very racist pseudoscience. Töpfer didn't agree with this pseudoscience, and he does his best to discredit it within this essay. However, he also applied some of these ideas to his caricature and comic practice. For example, characters with hooked noses and hunched backs were easily read as villains by an audience that was new to this kind of visual storytelling, and that relied on this intentional character design in order to make sense of what they were seeing. This is a brief view of the Histoire de Monsieur Villebois, Töpfer's most famous and widespread work. Early comics had to establish visual systems for clearly expressing information, such as these separate panels or the precursors to word bubbles at the bottom of the page. Töpfer recognized the value of caricature in being able to quickly tell an audience what was happening, who is the hero, villain, love interest of specific scenes. These signifiers present in his work became a part of the visual language of early comics, and through that was disseminated through early animation and into visual culture. This is an image from Thomas Nast, who was an extremely influential political illustrator with the nickname of the President Maker. He worked at Harper's Weekly as an editorial illustrator through 6 presidential elections and was considered to be a major influence on all of them during that time. He is credited with creating the symbols of the Democratic donkey and the Republican elephant in this image. As you can see, his images are narratively and visually dense. All of the characters have writing, and there is a clear middle, foreground, and background that all have a lot of visual information in them. His images were news in and of themselves, not just complementing the story. In contrast to Nast's editorial illustrations, Charles Danny Gibson was a celebrity illustrator. He got a contract for $100,000, equivalent to $3.5 million today. The reason he was able to get that deal was because at the height of his fame, he had a loyal fan base that followed him to all the publications he worked at, and because he was influential in terms of fashion trends, able to sell clothing or accessories very effectively. He is most famous for creating the Gibson Girl, an image of the American ideal white woman, athletic, elegant, stylish, and idly rich. Even just a few decades removed from Nast, Gibson's illustrations are aesthetically beautiful and technically very accomplished, but they are far shallower in their commentary. Starting during the First World War, there was a concentrated effort on the part of the US government to control the presentation of the war on the home front. This image, Weapons for Liberty by J.C. Leyendecker, specifically centers the figures of Lady Liberty and a Boy Scout, aimed at reaching young children and their mothers and wrapping them up into a narrative of the war. This image in particular has a prophetic feel, references imagery from myths and folktales such as the Sword and the Stone, and convinces the viewer that as long as they help prepare the army, that all will be fine in the end. Outside of his propaganda work, Leyendecker is most well known for his arrow collar men. Similar to the Gibson Girl, the arrow collar man represented an idealized white male American figure that appealed directly to the white middle class commercial desires and fantasies of the time. The power of the most famous and successful illustrators of this time was behind advertisement and consumer products, as opposed to the editorial or narrative functions of illustration in the 19th and 18th centuries. The illustrated mascot was a powerful tool for marketing that began to be utilized to full effect in the first half of the 20th century. The character design for Aunt Jemima was taken from a vaudeville poster advertising a minstrel show. This is a redesign from Haddon Sundblom in 1955. The purpose of illustrated mascots like this is that they give corporations and projects a face, character, narrative for consumers to relate to and become invested in. Aunt Jemima was one of the first corporate mascots, and she continued to be used by the Quaker Oats Company until 2021. This is an image also by Sunbloom of the Coca-Cola Santa campaign. Thomas Nast is credited with popularizing this version of Santa Claus, but Sunbloom's work from 1930 to 1965 made it ubiquitous and representative of consumerism, an association that is still strong within the American cultural consciousness. Joe Camel was a character created by illustrator Nicholas Price in 1972 for one ad in a specific magazine aimed at an adult audience. The image continued being used through 1992 and started being aimed at teen audiences. It stopped in 1992 because Price sued his employer for the payment he never got for this character design. Illustrators can be forced or tricked into doing illustrations for causes they don't agree with. The power of these images make them very effective for those causes. And finally, we have Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis, which covers her experiences growing up during the 1979 Iranian Revolution. It has been banned in Iran since being published in 2000. In an interview in 2023, Satrapi talks about how she has been contacted not only by Iranians who have gotten around the ban and were able to read the book, but also by people from around the globe who had lived through dictatorships or fundamentalist regimes. The ongoing ban is a clear sign that this story and these images have power to them and are threatening at least to the Iranian government. This is a quote from illustrator Steve Brodner's essay in The Education of an Illustrator. Quote, "The distinction I see between illustration and art is in content. What makes our job different and harder than other artistic pursuits is that we must do at least two things at once: solve formalistic, graphic, spatial, and color problems of all kinds, plus tell a literal story. Storytelling is a cultivated craft, ancient and deeply important to a culture. The truly fine illustrators share the mantle of shaman, along with poets, composer troubadours, playwrights, and filmmakers," unquote. This is the function illustration fills in human societies: explanation, storytelling, illumination. Because illustrations are productive images that have a purpose and a context, they fit very neatly into capitalist work structures, and a large amount of the contemporary illustration industry is centered around advertisement and marketing. Illustrators need intellectual tools within their own discipline in order to understand it, use it to its fullest extent, and innovate. Illustration was thought to be on the decline in recent years, and with AI, that is an ever more present thought. However, illustrators fulfill a more basic human need than the current consumer use. They are creators of culture and influencers of people. Further research is needed, and illustrators have to start investing into this research and understanding of their own discipline. Thank you all very much.
Alchemy has been defined as, quote, "a medieval speculative science aiming to achieve the transmutation of base metals into gold," unquote. This alternative science may have been a precursor to chemistry, yet its heavy reliance on symbolic activity has left this idea open to conjecture. Transmutation, frequently associated with alchemy, is defined as, quote, "the act of altering one's form, appearance, or nature into something greater," unquote. Similar to the term transformation, what differentiates the two words is the transmutative alteration into something greater, rather than a transformative dramatic change. This promise of producing something greater through the speculative experimentation attracted the attention of the surrealists, prompting many to produce alchemically inspired works. However, the resulting works focus on the fantastical distortion of the body rather than a complete physical change. In reaction to this, many female surrealists took initiative in expressing their alchemic interests steeped in occult symbolism. The paintings of Leonora Carrington and Remedios Varo embrace feminine ideas and domestic locations as spaces for alchemical performances. Carrington's transformation of the private sphere into a site of feminine power invites viewers to reconsider the kitchen table as a place of physical and spiritual nourishment. Varo's conversion of basic substances into instruments of creation supports the production of living entities through alchemical manifestation. Leonora Carrington and Remedios Varo transformed the alchemic process by synthesizing domestic feminine occupation with occult ritual, considering the concept of creation through organic transmutation as an alternative form of birth. Surrealism's fascination with alchemy has been experimented with by many recognized artists, but a conclusive portrayal of this process has never been reached. Salvador Dali had the potential to unite the alchemical process and the surrealist object through his hypothetical, psycho-atmospheric anamorphic objects. His 1933 essay describes an intricate operation in which objects are continuously transformed through acts of destruction until they are visually unrecognizable. Their formless lumps of iron share the appearance and structure of meteorites, despite their opposing methods of creation. While Dali's synthetic meteorites replicate a realistic transmutation, the process was deemed too complex for participants to successfully execute if it had come to fruition. Yet this essay may have stimulated the alchemic interest of Carrington and Varro. The pair's immigration to Mexico City during the 1940s granted them total immersion in alchemic, esoteric, and mystic teachings that liberated them from their Catholic upbringings. Carrington and Varro's exploration of Mexican street markets, similar to the one depicted, prompted the pair to consider the relationship between alchemy and cooking, particularly the significance of eggs within the speculative work. Rather than associating the object with its traditional symbol of fertility, the surrealists had connected this alchemical object to the domestic sphere through its purpose of creation. Surrealism's prior fascination with Freud's theory of the unconscious mind initially provided Varro with inspiration for her ethereal art, yet the same cannot be said for Carrington. While the latter acknowledged Freud's theories as integral to surrealism's foundation, it was the teachings of Russian philosopher George Gurdjieff and his approach to mindfulness that attracted both women to his work. Gurdjieff's most notable concept was the fourth way, defined as, quote, an approach to self-development through a series of exercises engaging bodily, emotional, and mindful awareness, unquote. This consistent mindfulness is displayed within Carrington and Varro's works through their meticulous application of materials and thought-provoking imagery. This thought process was supplemented by Gurdjieff's concept of the law of three, quote, a cosmic law stating that every event is the result of three factors, active, passive, and neutral or reconciling, end quote. This cosmic balance would create a sophisticated framework demonstrated in many of their occult works. However, art historian Terry Ark points out that both artists preferred the methods of Gurdjieff's follower Christopher Fremantle, whose approach to his master's teachings featured in his book On Attention, focused on tactile repetition combined with consistent mindfulness, was considered purer and more efficient. Despite this claim, it is evident that Carrington and Varro have kept Gurdjieff's laws in mind, while appreciating Fremantle's open-minded techniques through the creation of Abigail Quad and creation of the birds. Abigail Quad portrays an imminent alchemic transmutation through the occultation of a religious ritual. Art historian Susan Aberth describes the scene as reminiscent of the Catholic transubstantiation, or the conversion of wine into the blood of Christ prior to communion. While the very thought of an occult Catholic ceremony would make devout worshippers sign the cross upon viewing, Carrington has carefully curated these conflicting symbols to present an unconventional balance. This equilibrium of opposites is present among the multiple figures decorating the walls and the two egg-shaped beings present. The latter's equilibrium is most prominent through these entities, as the ancient guardian's exhaustive state serves in coherent opposition to the egg's invigorating golden glow. Creation of the birds portrays alchemy through the manipulation of alternative organic materials as ingredients for creation. Terra Ark suggests the owl woman's presence as a personification of alchemic wisdom, acting as a bridge between art and the speculative science. Concentrated moonlight and rain-based paints serve as a basis for production, yet Ark believes the stringed instrument around the being's neck to be the true source of creation. Through an intermingling of casual painting and novice musical talent, the owl woman has altered the process of alchemy to resist total isolation in the domestic realm. While this appears to be a reasonable solution to her loneliness, there's no guarantee that her avian creations will linger once presented with the option of freedom. The meticulously placed objects of Abigail Quad portray a balanced occult phenomenon that supports Gurdjieff's law of three. Despite her distaste toward the philosopher, Carrington abides by his law to execute her unconventional transmutation. The drippings from the white rose induce an alchemical reaction upon the lustrous egg, qualifying it as an active force through its engagement. The dark figure's stagnant activity during the imminent process signifies a passive force, since its idleness lacks contribution to the experiment. The neutral force falls upon the alchemical egg due to its current latent state as it prepares for its transformation. These forces culminate in the execution of a seemingly flawless transmutation, whose result is left up to interpretation. The owl woman's creation tools also support the law of three through their ability to simultaneously produce art and life. Varro's occult fascination, infused with Gurdjieff's law, suggests a union of objects to produce alchemical life. The string paintbrush connected to the owl woman's chest qualifies it as an active force, since it initiates the action of painting. The egg-shaped vessel distributing paint upon the palette is a passive force through its supportive position during the painting process. The moonlight filtering through the magnifying lens is the neutral force due to its function as an amplifier for a successful transmutation. This representation of forces through creative objects reflects the potential power of manifestation and artistic production. Susan Aberth describes the significance of the egg in alchemy through its shared appearance to the alembic, a vessel in which alchemical transmutations are performed. While the traditional alembics are made from clear glass, Carrington's opaque golden egg resists transparency in favor of leaving the process up to chance. While traditional her favoritism towards the egg originates from the mythology of her Celtic childhood, presenting the world's creation through its emergence from a serpent's egg. This personal connection between the alchemical egg and the domestic sphere is reflected through their expected productive potential and positive outcome. Yet this manifestation, like any experiment, remains unpredictable. Nevertheless, Carrington drew heavily upon these myths, intermingling with her Catholic upbringing and her perspective of the feminine sphere, resulting in unusual imagery that blurred the line between spirituality and alchemic science. Varro's alembic serves a similar purpose in housing alchemical ingredients prior to transmutation and its acceptance of unpredictability through its opaque nature. Art historian Janet Kaplan believes the presentation of the alembic as a tiered vessel alludes to a higher concentration of materials through the conversion of water into paint. This vessel is a key factor in uniting alchemy in the painting process for the owl woman's artistic production. Through her intense study of divination through I Ching or Book of Changes, Varro demonstrates her spiritual and scientific advancement by alluding to the separation of the eggs being a representation of earth and the heavens to reject her Catholic foundations. The egg-like alembic serves as a companion to the table found in both artists' works. Carrington's presentation of tables in her work promotes the concept of kitchens as magically charged spaces. Aberth's notion of the alchemical kitchen does not require ordinary utensils, but a table capable of withstanding extreme experimentation. The word table is strongly associated with the word tablet, as both objects are used in religious rituals. Sacred knowledge etched upon tablets preserves the values of organized belief systems. The table serves as a conduit in performing rituals based on these sacred texts and as a scientific workspace. This connection between communal dining and cementing hidden truths serves as a bridge between religious sacrament and alchemical ritual. Carrington's table refuses to accept its role as a domestic servant in favor of being the site of embryonic alchemical activity. Varro's table closely resembles an academic work desk, yet serves as a site of feminine creation. While Varro typically avoids depictions of religious ceremony in favor of scientific breakthroughs, Kaplan insists the table to be a location of an opposite enunciation. The careful manipulation of basic materials to produce life rather than through miraculous conception is, quote, a true form of alchemy, unquote. The desk serves as a conduit for alchemic creation through the artistic process. While the desk itself does not possess any magical properties, the owl woman performing her altered alchemy upon it automatically elevates its status to one of a sacred object. Like Carrington, the desk rejects its academic destiny in favor of being a vehicle for alchemical creation. The coffee grinder in Varro's work serves as a subtle reminder that the domestic sphere is a laboratory for everyday life. Akin to Aberth's conception of the alchemical kitchen, Ark believes the transmutation of substances is a daily occurrence, using the process of grinding coffee beans and brewing them into a drinkable substance as an example. While alchemy is believed to be a complex subject, the human body is in a constant state of transmutation through the conversion of energy. This rudimentary piece of machinery serves as a callback to the domestic space as a site of food preparation. The Owl Woman's lab, like her alteration of the alchemical process, is a secluded feminine space converted into a site of creation. The convergence of alchemical production and domestic occult activity results in the concept of alchemical birth. Combating its history of elemental conversion, the alchemical birth presented in the works of Carrington and Varro yields the creation of life through organic materials. The alchemical egg effectively serves as a conduit of transmutation residing within feminine spaces. Carrington's Abigail Quad and Varro's creation of the birds both portray alchemy as an alternative method of birth through the conversion of raw materials into conscious beings or potential alternative realities. Abigail Quad presents the notion of a direct alchemical birth through traditional transmutation. The percolated liquid dripping onto the alchemical egg and the resulting vaporization signals an imminent reaction. Aberth believes the cosmic egg remains in a dormant state until all suitable conditions are met, as the scene lacks a magician to perform the transmutation. If no magician arrives, the viewer must actively engage with the work to perform the experiment to create a new reality. The dark entity begins to deteriorate to support the equilibrium of opposites, yet it is unclear if the being's state of decay is self-induced or caused by the alchemical egg absorbing its essence. Creation of the Birds mimics an alternative form of motherhood through the union of alchemy and artistic production. The key to the successful birth is the stringed paintbrush from the owl woman's chest instrument, as sentience is bestowed upon the inanimate avians through the spiritual essence she provides them. The egg-shaped alembic and magnifying lens, while integral tools for this process, supplement the life-giving paintbrush. However, the owl woman's children retain the mentality of wild birds rather than the mindset of humans, as they have been given sentience, but lack knowledge. The owl mother momentarily retains an elevated mind through her alchemical creations, yet it is unknown how long she maintained this state of being. The alchemical birth presented through the works of Carrington and Varro results in an imperfect process that presents an uneven exchange of power. Abigail Quad and Creation of the Birds portray the detrimental consequences resulting from these successful transmutations. While the concept of equivalent exchange occurs in many of their alchemic works, the drastic transformations of their subjects are effectively presented regarding the unpredictability of this speculative science. The duality of the alchemical egg and the decaying entity reinforce the equilibrium of opposites through birth in Abigail Quad. To finalize the creation of a new reality, the festering entity must sacrifice itself to fulfill the alchemical birth. While the being's putrefied state supports its imminent demise, it retains a sentient mind the alchemical egg lacks, causing it to be aware of its fate and slow deterioration. Though it does not dread its expiration to accommodate the birth of the alchemical egg, the scene retains a melancholic feeling as the cycle of mortality takes place. Creation of the Birds demonstrates the performance of an alchemical birth by the owl mother that calls into question the consequences of her actions. This artistic alchemical exchange is having adverse effects on the figure's body through her repeated transmutations. By incorporating her human essence into her bird children, the owl mother slowly loses her sentience in response. The resulting regression into a creature which blurs the line between human and avian may reflect an otherworldly being, yet it is unknown if she remains sentient. This self-inflicted transmutation portrays the owl mother's dedication to her alchemic work to give life to her formerly inanimate offspring. In conclusion, Leonora Carrington's Abigail Quad and Remedios Faro's Creation of the Birds portray an artistic amalgamation of feminine alchemic power and occult knowledge resulting in an alchemical birth with significant consequences. Their surrealist contemporaries attempted to replicate the alchemical process through speculative forms, yet failed to achieve a realistic representation. The pair's immigration to Mexico City allowed them to explore these concepts in relation to domestic life through their elevation of the mundane. Through Gurdjieff's elevated mindfulness and the idea of metaphysical conception using owl women and cosmic eggs, alchemical transmutation as an alternative form of birth is achievable. Yet repeated or intense experimentation poses an elevated risk of losing oneself in the process, resulting in one contemplating the significant cost of equivalent exchange. Thank you.
In my research, I explore the ways in which queer experimental film redefines conventionally coded imagery to challenge heteronormative structures and binary expectations of gender. To better frame this exploration, I will briefly define the terms queer and experimental. These terms may seem commonplace, however, their relationship to film and narrative creation make their meanings complex. The term queer is commonly used to describe those who diverge from gender or sexual orientation norms. Merriam-Webster defines it as, quote, differing from what is usual or normal, end quote. Originally derogatory, the term has been reclaimed by many, especially influenced by queer theory, notably in Judith Butler's Gender Trouble and Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's Epistemology of the Closet. Butler challenges the idea of a fixed gender, proposing it as a series of continuous performative acts rather than an inevitable natural state. Sedgwick expands on this concept of performance in the book Tendencies, stating, quote, the term queer suggests the open mesh of possibilities, gaps, overlaps, dissonances and resonances, lapses and excesses of meaning when the constituent elements of anyone's gender, of anyone's sexuality, aren't made or can't be made to signify monolithically, end quote. For Butler and Sedgwick, the term queer functions as a destabilizing force that disrupts normative frameworks. Rather than referring solely to a specific sexual orientation or gender, queer encompasses a broader spectrum of non-conventional identities and practices, seeking to disrupt the binary categorization of subjectification and categorization through juridical representations. In film, queer acts take shape in the form of a meta performance, which functions as a critique of the conventional. The purpose of this confrontation finds a suitable medium in the experimental. Commonly understood as it relates to film at large, the experimental is a confrontation of conventional practices in filmmaking. However, film at large is broad, and what we consider conventional is continuously changing. To best understand the aim of experimental and avant-garde film, one must turn to the manifestos written by those establishing figures in its history. Scott McKenzie notes in his book, Film Manifestos and Global Cinema Cultures, that a unifying thread throughout experimental film manifestos is, quote, a profound concern with alternative ways of seeing, and underlying this concern, despite the subsequent claims that that different ways of seeing the cinema meant different ways for spectators to see the world, perhaps even the world as it actually was, and not how they, through indoctrination ideology, thought they saw it, end quote. Though it has been utilized to serve many agendas throughout its history, a continuous consideration in experimental and avant-garde film is the production of radical perception, and the question of whose truth is reflected through the lens. Queer experimental filmmakers continuously address this concern using conventionally coded imagery. Maya Deren's use of self-representation in Meshes of the Afternoon and Kenneth Anger's employment of obscene collage in Scorpio Rising are particularly important in understanding how this imagery is redefined. Self-representation is critical in the confrontation of traditionally coded imagery. The work of Maya Deren was hugely impactful and a major step forward in the queering of America's avant-garde film scene in the 1940s. Deren set an example for queer filmmakers such as Kenneth Anger and Barbara Hammer. The American Film Institute granted the Maya Deren Award for Independent Film and Video Artists from 1986 to 1996. Of the inaugural recipients of the award was the video artist Namjoon Paik, known heavily as the father of video art. However, despite its lasting impact, Deren's work was considered controversial and overlooked by many in its time, as many great works of art often are. Part of what made Deren's work both heavily influential and controversial was Deren's use of self-representation to confront the Oedipal narrative in film. The Oedipal narrative centers around a male-dominant representation. Any appearance of woman, object, or space is portrayed within the context of a male perception. The quintessential Oedipal narrative tied to the Freudian Oedipus complex involves the heterosexual male protagonist confronting a crisis, resolving it, and winning over a woman, or obtaining the approval of another male character, ultimately serving the purpose of achieving the idyllic masculinity by separating himself from his mother. The Oedipal narrative is an extremely common and fairly simplistic structure seen in most mainstream cinema, such as action movies. Deren's self-representation centers her own identity as a woman in the narrative of the film, inviting a sense of truth as well as positioning the representation in direct opposition to the conventional Oedipal narrative. Teresa L. Geller references the 1970s essay by Carol Hanich in her own essay, The Personal Cinema of Maya Deren, stating, quote, Deren's personal cinema exemplifies the feminist anthem, the personal is political, by atomizing the psychoanalytic processes ascribed to woman. By analogizing the girl child's experience of the structuring principle of the unconscious, the Oedipal drama, the film positions itself against cinema's typical theme of the masculine subject's Oedipal narrative, with woman as the object and outcome of desire, end quote. Deren's identity as a woman, enmeshed as a driving narrative in the film, alongside the impression of truth of autobiography through the unification of author, narrator, and protagonist, place the film and all representations within it outside of the traditionally masculine perceptions in cinema, which up until this point was a dominant practice of representation in narrative storytelling. Deren's Meshes of the Afternoon is a 14-minute, 16mm short in black and white that follows an unnamed woman. The woman falls into a dream state upon arriving at her home, in which the darkness and fear within her subconscious are revealed. In her dream, the woman chases after a figure wearing black robes with a mirror concealing its face. It carries a white flower. The woman follows the figure up the stairs of her home, where the figure places the white flower on a bed. The scene repeats. When she looks at the bed again, a knife appears in place of the flower, and the scene repeats until eventually there are multiple versions of herself, sitting around a table. And as three versions of the woman watch the fourth sleep, they place a key on the table and take turns picking it up until it turns into a knife in the third version's hand. She approaches her sleeping self menacingly with the knife when suddenly the dream is interrupted by a man apparently waking up the woman. However, it is unclear whether this remains an event within the dream. The man carries the white flower, and as the woman follows him up the stairs, he repeats the act of placing the flower on the bed. Seeing himself in a small mirror next to the bed, he turns it over. The woman then lays next to the flower, and as the man sits next to her, the flower turns into a knife once more. The sequence then cuts to the man entering the home, only this time where he previously found the sleeping woman. She appears lifeless in her chair, chaos and broken glass strewn around her. Throughout the film, the imagery involved sends clear messaging through distorted visuals and a perplexing narrative structure that draws on the surrealist attempt to conceptualize the dreamlike state of the unconscious mind. By situating the signs, the key, the knife, and the flower outside of the traditional Oedipal narrative, the gendered representation of the images changes, and the interpretation of object meaning is forcibly altered. For example, the image of the key, which is traditionally a sign of access and domesticity, is removed from its traditional context and juxtaposed with the image of the knife. The knife itself, while maintaining its fear factor, becomes representative of freedom from the endless cycle of the dream. It is Darren's use of self-representation that allows these images to take on new meanings and forces the viewer to interpret the story through an unconventional lens, leading to new or alternate codification of images and thus changing the way that we understand traditional concepts such as domesticity and access. One of the final recipients of the Maya Deren Award in 1996 was the legendary Kenneth Anger, who passed away in March of 2023. A profoundly impactful filmmaker, Anger began his involvement in the film scene as a child actor, but began making his own experimental films in 1941 at the age of 14. His experimental shorts were, for their time, radically and unapologetically queer. Often his films are considered pornographic and obscene. While these may be true characteristics, the grotesque, the obscene, and the sexually explicit were necessary elements of Anger's films, substantiating a more complex visualization rather than reading as mere smut, a term in which Anger himself did not believe. Scorpio Rising draws on elements of the classic road movie, such as Thunder Road and Hollywood or Bust, in which the road cultivates a sense of outlaw freedom. However, Anger draws attention simultaneously to road scene imagery and to the underground, rebellious, homoerotic cult scene of the 1960s. Utilizing a collage technique reminiscent of surrealist artist Louis Buñuel and the montage of Sergei Eisenstein, Scorpio Rising begins with a young man uncovering a motorcycle, close-up shots of various components, and shots of studded leather attire, all set to a version of the song Fools Rush In, Where Angels Fear to Tread, sung by Ricky Nelson. The film progresses through a nomadic narrative structure, a term coined by Jung-ga Kim meaning, quote, a narrative that fractures and recreates itself through gaps and rewritten portions, gaining its own sense of agency, end quote. The nomadic narrative structure reflects yet another element frequently found in the conventional road movie, although exaggerated here by the separation of plot points into segments measured by the length of various pop songs of the early 1960s from musicians such as Elvis Presley, Ray Charles, Peggy March, and the Crystals, the lyrics all of which express heterosexual relationships. Continuing to follow the motorcycle crew, the film ramps up in pace and in eroticism, capturing sexually suggestive and somewhat crude moments between the predominantly male members of the motorcycle crew. In traditional road movies, the vehicle conveys a sense of unapologetically hypermasculine sense of freedom and rebellion. Anger takes this symbol of the vehicle, the motorcycle, and enmeshes it in a conglomeration of signs relating to sexuality, religion, and politics, and resulting in a conglomeration of images that are no longer inextricably tied to any identifiable socially constructed meaning, but instead are blurred into one another. A later sequence involves an underground party during which the crew engages in various ritualistic and sexual acts, spliced with scenes from an educational film intended for a Lutheran school, which incidentally had been delivered to Anger's apartment by mistake. In this sequence, the motorcycle itself becomes a fetishized object through various scenes of sexual acts being conducted on the vehicle, thereby fetishizing the hypermasculine freedom it previously represented. The motorcycle is not the only imagery that is appropriated in this manner throughout the film. As Ed Lowry writes in his essay for The Velvet Light Trap, The Appropriation of Signs in Scorpio Rising, quote, Anger's manipulations of the culturally overloaded imagery of Nazism, sadomasochism, and the occult finally result in a film which refuses to conform to any dominant edifying reading whatsoever, an almost unparalleled achievement which should earn Scorpio Rising an enduring place in the artistic annals of the 1960s, a decade remembered for the challenges it posed to ruling ideology, end quote. Whereas Darren situates traditionally coded objects directly in opposition to their conventional context, Anger's use of cinematic collage impairs the conventional reading of the imagery involved, culminating in a deconstruction of its meaning. This difference of approach in the confrontation of the conventional can only be attributed to their difference in identity, regardless of gender and sexual orientation of the individual, as the resulting reflections of the real are visualized through alternative perspectives. As long as there remains the existence of a binary or a conventional standard of expectation, the deficiency in the truth of representation in film must be recognized. If we as image makers aim to confront this inadequacy, we must examine the work of those artists who have marked the history of film with radical perception. I'd like to end with a quote from the manifesto of experimental filmmaker Stan Brakhage, Metaphors on Vision. Quote, the absolute realism of the motion picture is unrealized, therefore potential magic. Thank you.
So I was really interested in your presentation on sort of these parallels in the canon of illustration kind of fighting for its independence, I think, which is implied by the void and research on it that you sort of mentioned. And I saw a lot of parallels to sort of the fight between art and craft and the definition of craft as its own sort of, I guess, canon and like its legitimacy as art, basically. So I just wanted to ask, would you say that in the future, do you see illustration kind of merging into the art historical canon, or would you say that in the future it would more so strengthen its own canon and become its own sort of recognized thing to the same sort of level, I guess, as, you know, if that makes sense, the parallel of art historical canon?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. In my research, I covered a bit in my longer paper, the history of illustration, especially in the early 20th century. Illustrators were working class artists, and there wasn't any necessarily tracks for being having an arts education in illustration specifically. That's something that's changing now. The demographics of illustrators are changing. More and more illustrators are upper middle class white, college educated people. So I think that's an interesting shift, and I'm not entirely sure how that will change how illustration is remembered. But also I would say illustration, some of the research I was diving into is also that illustration needs to define its own discipline and take responsibility and put energy and research into developing its own intellectual tools and its own history and systems of education. So I think that I would hope, I guess, for the future of illustration that it goes more of that craft route and that it maintains some of its independence and the things that make it unique from art or from the art historical canon.
Just a briefly kind of like, wrapping up activity, I noticed, and I'm sure our wonderful Dr. Debra Parr may have some organizing decisions there. In the first portion of the symposium, one of the connecting themes for me, in addition to Amy's comments, was social commentary, right? How in each paper there was some interest in changing the world around us, although each one was different and each argument was different. And in this portion of the symposium, I was intrigued with how you all deal with the question of identity. Identity as a social, cultural, individual construct, and how artists or illustrators, right, are participating in those constructs through their creative practice. So I was curious if you would like to say a few comments about that in relation to your individual project, because each one was fascinating, to be perfectly honest. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. That's really, I think, interesting for each of us to think about individually and how all of our topics relate to each other. I think that identity is a huge part of what my research was based in, because I was looking at how queer filmmakers, which can be taken really broadly, but how queer filmmakers represent their own identity through the film that they're creating. So I think looking at film as a lens, in both the sense that it is allowing the creator to project their own identity, and a screen for others to view that identity and experience the world in somewhat of a similar way, and understand that there are multiple ways to experience the world, I think.
So like having agency in a world that those dominant ideas they are resisting to, right?
Yeah, very much so.
Very good, Abigail. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Owner. That's quite lovely. So, as far as identity, like towards the artists I've chosen, which is Ramiro Sparrow and Leonora Carrington, both of them are still distinctly European artists, even though they have relocated Mexico City, which of course was due to the Second World War. I think that they still embrace themselves as like European and Spanish individuals who just happen to be living in a different place, which allowed them to explore concepts of like alchemy and occult and all these sorts of like esoteric ideas without being heavily influenced by like other art. If they was you're like in New York City, because they would have been more pushed towards like the abstraction and stuff like that. So I just feel kind of like identity does kind of shift and change, but these two definitely stuck with like the concepts that intrigued them to kind of reject their old identity and like embrace a new one, as kind of a sense like that.
Thank you for the question, Owner. I think that especially in recent years, like in the past few decades, the profession of illustration has become increasingly isolated. Illustrators work completely alone in their own studios. Sometimes they don't even see the clients they work for. It's just emails back and forth. And I think because the work is so isolated in a lot of circumstances, illustrators really have to seek out community with each other and build that identity of the profession and of the craft. And I think that in a world that is increasingly online and increasingly isolated for a lot of different kinds of people, that has not been a priority for the illustration community, and I think it should be. I think it has to be for the future. I mean, the future will march on either way, but we have some agency in how it all plays out. And I think that taking that agency and creating a community and a discipline and a communication within that discipline is essential.
And also, like, I'm always fascinated how in the history of illustration, there's always this kind of progressive wave that's ahead of like societal constructs and lead that discourse into new directions. If you look at the history of X-Men, for instance, there are wonderful examples of that as well. But even in the traditional examples you share with us, it is hard not to imagine that these illustrators are aware of some of the cultural norms they are feeding into as a part of those advertising strategies. So I think that was quite interesting to think about. So thank you for giving us an opportunity for that. Thank you, friends.
Thank you. I also just want to real quick to expand on that illustration is communication, and the purpose is communication. And I think that has freed illustrators in the history of illustration to really go for making a point, even if they're doing a job and they're getting money for it, and you got to eat, so you got to do jobs you don't like sometimes. But even within those kinds of jobs, or jobs that seem restrictive or capitalist, there is an ability for illustrators to kind of subversively plant messages and communication that can be unearthed decades later. So I think that's really interesting.
And also, just a quick comment about the illustration thing. I think we are still working with terms like art and illustration from a Eurocentric point of view. And I think that may be something interesting to revisit in the future, because if you look at the history of art, it is also a history of illustration. So it may not be as divided, at least in historical practice. In my field of Islamic art, the things we call paintings are illustrations. They are illustrations specifically for handmade books, but curators in the Eurocentric museums started naming them paintings, so now everybody is naming them paintings. Similar examples are found in Mayan books and Buddhist books in Asia. So I think it may be potentially something that can liberate us and create those kind of connected stories that we desperately need right now. So you may be up to something there if you pursue that.
I have a question for Abigail. I was wondering, after your research for your presentation, has your perception of queer and queer culture been altered at all in any way? And also, I know your presentation began with the common definition for queer, and I was wondering what your personal definition of the word might be.
I think that my research led me to be exposed to a lot of queer film that I hadn't been before. So I don't know if my perception of it has changed so much. It has grown probably a lot, in a lot of ways. I think that the dictionary definition of queer being something that is not normal is a restrictive definition in and of itself, in that it implies that there is a normal, and that anything that is not normal is queer, and then that puts things back into kind of a binary where you have normal and not normal, and it's a whole mess. But I don't know, I'm not sure exactly what the answer is for a good definition of the word queer. You'd have to ask Butler and Sedgwick. Thank you for the question.
I was curious if you see an impact in Varro's and Carrington's work with them having fled the war. Do you see the war having imbued itself on these artworks or any of them at all that you've looked at?
That is a wonderful question, B. Thank you. Honestly, throughout my research, if anything, it's more Carrington who has kind of used the effects of World War II in her art and also in her writing, especially when she was trying to flee the war. She ended up being institutionalized in a hospital, and they performed many, many disgusting things on her, and she actually wrote a story called Down Below, so if anyone wants to check it out. But Varro, in a sense, kind of avoids war entirely, is what I've seen. If anything, it's more of a celestial representation, but it's not very pronounced, so to speak. So you could definitely tell that there's influences in their early-ish works, probably right when they arrived around the mid to late 40s, and then it started evolving into more whimsical and occult during the 50s onwards. That's kind of what I've noticed, at least. Thank you for your question.